So recently, I was researching warriors from history, and I came across a name I'd honestly never heard before, Tlahuicole, and I don't know why. But after researching him, I kept asking myself one question. Why does almost nobody talk about this guy? Because the more I looked into him, the crazier his story became. And what's even more interesting is that his story isn't based on one random internet article. I found his story preserved across multiple historical sources. His story appears in the accounts of Diego Muñoz Camargo, Diego Duran, and Hernando Alvarado Tezozomoc. And before we continue, I should apologize in advance if I pronounce any of these names incorrectly. They come from languages and cultures that aren't my own, and I want to treat them with respect. So if I get one wrong, I'm sorry. Now, let's forget the books for a moment. Let's go back to the beginning, because before Tlahuicole became a legend, he was a warrior. Tlahuicole lived in central Mexico during the final years before the arrival of the Spanish, and this was a world where powerful indigenous states were constantly fighting for territory, power, and survival. At the center was the Mexica Empire, with its enormous capital, Tenochtitlan. But one of its most stubborn enemies was Tlaxcala. Tlaxcala was a powerful group of allied states that had resisted Mexica pressure for years, and Tlahuicole came from this world. The historical traditions identify him as an Otomi warrior associated with Tlaxcala. We don't know much about his childhood, and honestly, that's where most biographies would start making things up. We won't. What the sources do tell us is what happened when Tlahuicole became a warrior. And that's where his story gets interesting. The accounts describe Tlahuicole as an exceptionally powerful fighter. He was not a particularly tall man, but he was broad, strong, and feared. He fought with a macuahuitl, a wooden weapon fitted with sharp obsidian blades. According to Muñoz Camargo, the weapon was so heavy that an ordinary man would struggle to lift it, and his reputation became even bigger than his strength. The account says that when his enemies heard his name, some of them would simply run. Wherever Tlahuicole entered the fight, he was said to tear through the warriors in front of him. Some of these descriptions clearly belong to a heroic tradition, so we shouldn't treat every claim like a modern statistic. But one thing is clear: Tlahuicole was remembered as an extraordinary warrior, and eventually, even the Mexica would know his name. Then came the moment that changed everything. Tlahuicole was fighting against the Huexotzincas, and during the battle, he was finally captured. According to Muñoz Camargo, he became trapped in a marsh. The enemy found him, captured him, and put him inside a wooden cage. Then they took him to Tenochtitlan, to the most powerful ruler in the region, Moctezuma II, and this is where Tlahuicole's story takes its first unbelievable turn. Moctezuma didn't kill him, he respected him, and he offered him something most prisoners would have begged for: freedom. Tlahuicole refused. Now think about that. A prisoner offered his freedom and saying no. Why? According to the Tlaxcalan tradition, Tlahuicole believed that returning home after being captured would bring dishonor. So Moctezuma tried something else. If Tlahuicole wouldn't return to Tlaxcala, then perhaps he could serve the Mexica. And Moctezuma offered him command of part of the Mexica army. Tlahuicole accepted, and now the story becomes almost impossible to believe. A captured enemy warrior was now leading the army of the empire that had captured him. Moctezuma sent the army west, toward the Purepecha frontier. The campaign lasted for months. The Mexica failed to conquer the Purepecha territory, but they returned with captives and valuable goods. And according to the Tlaxcalan account, Tlahuicole had fought so bravely that he earned a new reputation, not just among his own people, among the Mexica. The people who had captured him now admired him. When Tlahuicole returned to Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma gave him another choice. He could stay and become a Mexica commander, or he could return to Tlaxcala. Tlahuicole refused both. He would not betray his homeland, but he also refused to return home after being captured. So Moctezuma asked him what he wanted, and Tlahuicole gave him an answer. He wanted to die, but not like an ordinary prisoner. He wanted to die as a warrior. Moctezuma agreed, and the final chapter of the famous version of Tlahuicole's story began. For 8 days, Tlahuicole was celebrated. There were dances, feasts, and ceremonies. Then came the final day. He was taken to the Temelacatl, the circular stone used for gladiatorial ritual combat. Tlahuicole was tied to the stone. He was given a weapon and shield. His opponents were free to move. He was not. But the fight began anyway. And, according to Muñoz Camargo, Tlahuicole fought. He killed more than 8 men and wounded more than 20 before he was finally overwhelmed. A captured warrior, bound to a stone, surrounded by enemy fighters, still fighting until the end. According to this tradition, Tlahuicole was then sacrificed to Huitzilopochtli, and that should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't, because remember those other historical sources? They tell us something very different. Diego Duran and Hernando Alvarado Tezozomoc preserve another tradition, and in this version, Tlahuicole's story becomes much darker. After his capture, he is treated with honor by Moctezuma. He is given rich clothing. He is cared for. But time passes, and Tlahuicole begins thinking about his wife and his children. He becomes increasingly sad. He stops hiding it, and eventually, he begins to cry. For Moctezuma, this is not a sign of grief. It is a sign of weakness. He sees the tears of a future sacrificial victim as a bad omen and becomes angry. Tlahuicole is released, but now he has nowhere to go. According to this tradition, he ends up wandering from house to house asking for food. Eventually, desperate, he goes to Tlatelolco. He climbs the Great Pyramid and throws himself from the top. He dies. The Mexica then take his heart and perform the customary ritual. So, which story is true? The warrior who chose a glorious death on the stone, or the captive who was eventually broken by his circumstances? The honest answer is, we don't know. And that's important, because these aren't two tiny differences. They are two completely different versions of the same man's final days. In the Tlaxcalan tradition, Tlahuicole becomes the perfect warrior, a man who chooses honor over life, a man who refuses freedom, refuses to betray his homeland, and fights until he is finally defeated. In the Mexica traditions, we see something much more tragic. A warrior who misses his family, breaks down under captivity, and eventually takes his own life. And modern historian Michael Graulich argues that it is difficult to determine which version is historically correct. The two traditions may even reveal how different communities wanted Tlahuicole to be remembered, and that is what makes Tlahuicole so fascinating, because he wasn't remembered as an emperor, he didn't build an empire, he didn't rule a kingdom, he was remembered as a warrior whose reputation became so powerful that even his enemies remembered him. And centuries later, his story survived. His name remained part of Tlaxcala's historical memory. His image was later transformed into art. And today, we can still find his story buried inside old historical accounts. But outside Mexico, how many people have ever heard the name Tlahuicole? Probably very few. And that's exactly what made me stop when I first found him. Because sometimes history doesn't hide its greatest stories. Sometimes we simply stop looking for them. Tlahuicole may have died more than 500 years ago. We may never know exactly which version of his final moments is closest to the truth, but we do know this. His name survived, his story survived, and somewhere between history and legend, There was a warrior whose reputation was once known across the world he lived in. A warrior most of us never knew existed. His name was Tlahuicole, the warrior you never know. If you want to discover more warriors whose stories history almost forgot, subscribe. Because Tlahuicole wasn't the only one. There are so many warriors out there whose names most of us have never even heard. And we're going to find them. I'll see you in the next one.